Hello, and welcome back to Sleepy Story Facts, where tonight's sleep story becomes a bedtime story carried on dark water. A nighttime story told far below the reach of wind and moon, a relaxing story for anyone ready to fall asleep to the quiet marvels of the living ocean. So, before we begin our long drift among the soft mysteries of the deep, allow your body to loosen by one small degree at a time. Let your jaw unclench. Let your tongue rest comfortably. Let your shoulders sink as though they have remembered an ancient and easy gravity. And let your breathing become smooth and unhurried, because there is nowhere to rush to hear, nowhere to perform, nowhere to solve. Only a gentle bedtime descent into a world that has spent millions of years mastering the art of silence. Imagine, if you like, that you are floating on a calm vessel at night, the sea around you dark as velvet and almost perfectly still. And now imagine that the water beneath you is not empty at all, but spacious and inhabited, full of soft-bodied drifters, slow swimmers, patient hunters, transparent beings, glowing signals, feathery arms, and folding fins, each one moving through the pressure, and cold with the kind of quiet assurance that makes this calming narration feel less like a lesson and more like a door opening inward. As you settle deeper into this sleep story, you may picture the upper ocean dimming above you, blue becoming indigo, indigo becoming ink. And with every slow breath, you descend a little farther from noise, a little farther from clocks, a little farther from the bright and busy surface world, until the sea begins to feel like a vast underwater cathedral, cool and roomy and hushed, with living lanterns suspended in the dark. One of the first deeply comforting facts to rest beside is that many deep-sea creatures do not fight the darkness at all. They belong to it, and creatures such as lanternfish carry tiny light-making organs called photophores that glow softly, helping them communicate, confuse predators, or blend with the faint light above in a trick known as counter-illumination. And somehow, there is something wonderfully peaceful in that. The idea that even in great darkness, life does not panic. It simply learns to glow in the gentlest possible way. Nearby, perhaps drifting like a little velvet umbrella, is the dumbo octopus, a real deep-sea octopus named for the ear-like fins on the sides of its head. And rather than racing through the water, it often pulses and glides with a calm, buoyant elegance, as though it has discovered a slower rhythm than the rest of the world, and never felt any need to abandon it. Farther off, comb jellies move like living glass, fragile and nearly invisible. And although they are not true jellyfish, their rows of tiny beating cilia scatter light into faint rainbows, making them seem like pieces of moving starlight translated into water. And in this quiet place, even their motion appears delicate enough not to disturb a dream. There are sea cucumbers on the ocean floor too, creatures so untroubled in their pace that they seem almost invented by sleep itself, gently processing bits of organic material from the seabed, turning the deep into a place not just of mystery, but of patient recycling, where nothing is wasted and everything settles into usefulness. And then there is the barrel-eye fish, with its transparent dome-like head and upward-pointing eyes, a creature so unusual that it feels at first like fantasy, yet it lives quite matter-of-factly in the deep, teaching us that strangeness can also be serene, that what looks alien can simply be another version of adaptation, another calm answer to the conditions of pressure, darkness, and distance as we continue downward in this bedtime story. Notice how the ocean does not become empty, but more finely detailed, because the deep sea is less a void than a slow library of specialized lives. Each page written in soft tissue, careful energy use, and luminous restraint. The anglerfish, so often described with too much drama, can be thought of more gently here, as a creature carrying its own small lamp, a little patient beacon extended before its face, conserving effort in a world where food may be scarce and movement is expensive. And even that famous lure becomes less frightening when seen through the lens of necessity, simply one more quiet tool for survival in a place that rewards stillness. Not far away in our imagination, a vampire squid drifts with its cloak-like webbing spread. Despite the theatrical name being a shy and delicate animal that often feeds on what scientists call marine snow, the soft, constant fall of organic particles from upper waters. So even in the deep, there is weather of a kind, a slow snowfall of life, returning to life. And if that image helps you grow heavier in the best way, keep it, because marine snow is one of the loveliest truths of the ocean, a continuous, gentle descent of tiny fragments, feeding unseen worlds below. Some creatures here, like siphonophores, are not single animals in the simple way we usually imagine, but colonies of many specialized bodies working together so seamlessly that they appear to be one, which means the deep sea is full not only of individuals, but of living cooperation, drifting communities stitched into long, translucent ribbons. Even the fangtooth fish, with a name sharper than its daily life, is small and efficient, built for darkness and pressure, reminding us that the deep often sounds harsher than it feels when described slowly. And through it all, the water presses close from every side, not as a threat in this story, but as a blanket, firm and surrounding, a world that muffles edges and asks every creature to move with intention, to spend energy wisely, to trust the dark. And perhaps that is why this gentle bedtime journey can carry you so naturally toward deep sleep, because the ocean below is a masterclass in quiet living, in doing only what is needed, in glowing only when it matters, in drifting when drifting is enough. And tonight, as your breath lengthens and your thoughts begin to soften around the edges, you do not need to reach the bottom of the sea. You only need to keep descending through this calming narration, deeper into softness, deeper into stillness, deeper into the ancient water where light becomes whisper, motion becomes lullaby, and the hidden lives of deep-sea creatures keep their calm and wordless watch while you rest. Now that you have drifted farther from the restless surface, this sleep story can lower you into a deeper layer of the ocean, a softer and darker place where the water seems to hold its breath. And in this bedtime story, the descent is so slow that it almost feels like floating in place, because the deep sea does not hurry anyone, and neither will this gentle bedtime narration, which is only here to carry you downward with a steady rhythm, toward deep sleep, toward quiet, toward the kind of stillness that feels wide enough to rest inside. Here in the Bathypelagic zone, often called the midnight zone, sunlight no longer reaches in any meaningful way. And yet, the darkness is not empty, because many of the animals here have made their own small stars, their own patient glimmers, their own calm and careful lights. And among them are hatchetfish, with thin silver bodies shaped a little like polished blades, though their lives are far gentler than their name suggests. And along their undersides, they carry photophores, tiny organs that shine downward in a dim pattern, so they can blend with the faint trace of light from above. A trick of living geometry and softness known as counter-illumination, which makes them seem less like fish and more like moving thoughts as you continue to fall asleep within this relaxing story. Imagine one of them passing below you, barely stirring the water, its body reflecting almost nothing, its light so measured that it seems to understand exactly how much brightness the night requires and no more. And this is one of the deep sea's loveliest lessons, that even in profound darkness, life often survives not by force, but by subtlety. Nearby, a bristlemouth drifts in the black water, and although it is small and unassuming, fish of this kind are believed to be among the most abundant vertebrates on Earth, which means that one of the ocean's great success stories is not a giant or a dramatic predator, but a tiny deep dweller with a modest body and a mouth full of delicate teeth, living quietly in numbers almost beyond imagination. And there is something deeply soothing in that idea, that the hidden world is upheld not only by the famous and the enormous, but by the small and steady. Lower still, the water grows cooler, and the sense of distance grows dreamlike. And on the seafloor, where the ocean becomes a broad, dark plain, giant isopods move with untroubled patience, crustaceans related to the little woodlice found in gardens, though enlarged here into pale, armored wanderers with many legs and calm, deliberate motions. And because food can be scarce in the deep, they are built for waiting, able to go long stretches without eating, conserving energy with a kind of biological wisdom that feels perfectly suited to a nighttime story, where nothing needs to be rushed, and every movement can remain small. Not far from them, tripod fish rest above the seabed on long fin rays, balancing as if on delicate stilts, facing into the current and letting the water bring possible food toward them. And in their posture, there is almost a meditative quality, as though they have mastered the art of standing still in the middle of a slow, invisible wind. Scattered across the sediment are sea cucumbers again, humble little custodians of the ocean floor, processing the fine rain of organic matter that settles from above, while amphipods, tiny crustaceans like translucent deep-sea cousins of shrimp, pick through the drifting particles with tireless gentleness. And above them, marine snow continues to fall, the soft and silent weather of the abyss, a constant downward whisper made of minute fragments from the living world overhead, feeding creatures that never see the sun, and yet remain intricately connected to it. Here two live snailfish, soft-bodied and delicate in appearance, some of them found at astonishing depths, their flexible bodies better suited to crushing pressure than the more rigid skeletons of shallower fish. And that is another peaceful truth of the deep. that survival here often comes through yielding rather than resisting, through softness rather than hardness, through an almost graceful acceptance of the world as it is. In the middle distance, a gulper eel drifts with its long tail trailing behind it, its mouth famously large, though in this calming narration it need not seem monstrous at all, only specialized. Another creature shaped by scarcity and distance, another reminder that the deep ocean does not make mistakes, only variations, each one adjusted over immense stretches of time to suit a dark and spacious home. And then, if you imagine turning slowly in the water, you might see the faint outline of a siphonophore extending through the darkness like a transparent ribbon. Not one animal in the simplest sense, but a colony of many bodies working together so seamlessly that they move as a single living thread, each part specialized, each part cooperating. A drifting example of how life can become more elegant through partnership. And on certain parts of the seafloor, where minerals and warmth rise from below, tube worms have anchored themselves in quiet colonies, not feeding in the ordinary way, but relying on internal bacteria that transform chemicals into nourishment. So even here, in hidden places beneath miles of water, life has found serene and astonishing methods for continuing, as though the earth itself were softly inventing new lullabies in the dark. By now, this sleep story may feel less like a journey and more like a suspension, as if you are no longer descending through the sea, but simply being held within it. And that is perfectly right for a bedtime story like this, because the deep ocean is not asking you to understand every creature at once, only to notice the pattern they share, the low energy grace, the patient design, the glowing restraint, the way so many of them conserve, drift, hover, wait, or pulse rather than rush. And perhaps that is why the midnight sea can become such a peaceful place to fall asleep, because it offers a world where stillness is not emptiness, where darkness is not absence, where even the strangest body can belong beautifully, and where the quiet goes on and on, like a vast underwater cradle rocking, almost too slowly to feel, until your thoughts begin to loosen, your breathing deepens, and your mind follows the marine snow downward into a softer and softer shade of rest as this sleep story continues its gentle descent. Your nighttime story carries you past the last familiar hints of the upper ocean and into a region so calm and spacious that it seems almost woven from silence itself. And here the seafloor opens wide beneath you like a dark and velvety plain, smooth in some places, softly ridged in others, with little rises and hollows that cradle a patient world of animals built not for hurry, but for endurance. And in this relaxing story, you do not need to travel quickly across it, because the deep sea is best known slowly, the way one learns a lullaby, one soft note at a time. Drifting above the sediment are sea pens, relatives of corals that anchor themselves in the bottom and rise like feathery quills from the mud. And when currents move through them, they seem to sway with such easy grace that they could almost be underwater grasses in a dream, while nearby brittle stars lift their fine arms into the water to gather passing food, each movement so delicate that it feels less like feeding and more like listening as your body grows heavier and your thoughts grow lighter. Imagine the ocean floor receiving the endless descent of marine snow. Those tiny flakes of organic material that fall from brighter waters above. And think of how the abyss is sustained by this quiet nourishment, by a slow, invisible weather that settles over the deep in a constant silver hush, feeding worms, crustaceans, and soft-bodied dwellers that make a life from what the sea gently sends downward. There are xenophyophores here too, giant single-celled organisms that live on the seafloor and build intricate forms from the sediment around them. And it is one of the loveliest deep ocean truths that even a single cell, given enough time and the right conditions, can become large enough to shape the landscape in miniature, offering shelter to smaller creatures, and proving that grandeur in the deep is not always loud or fast, but sometimes simply patient. A little farther on, glass sponges rise from the bottom like pale lantern towers, their skeletons made from silica and their bodies filtering the water with a steadiness that suits this gentle bedtime hour. And some of them may live for many years, quietly participating in the slow circulation of the abyss, while around their bases, tiny animals find a place to settle. So even the stillest forms become a kind of home. If you continue your calm drift forward, you may notice deep-sea coral gardens emerging from the darkness, not bright like shallow tropical reefs, but pale, cream-colored, rose-tinted, and softly branching, growing in cold black water over long spans of time, creating shelter for fish, shrimp, and starfish. And their presence reminds us that the word coral does not belong only to sunlit lagoons, because even here, in the cold and the dark, intricate structures are built grain by grain, branch by branch, as though the ocean itself were knitting in its sleep. This is one reason the abyss feels so comforting in a calming narration like this one, because it is full of lives that trust gradual processes, lives that grow millimeter by millimeter, feed particle by particle, and move only when movement matters. And perhaps that is why your own breathing has become slower by now, why your mind has begun to mirror the sea's own rhythm, why the world above has become pleasantly distant above the plain. A phantom-like jelly drifts by, its bell nearly transparent, its trailing arms faint as strands of moonlit silk. And not far away, a small deep-sea shrimp flashes a brief pulse of bioluminescence, not to startle you in this bedtime story, but to remind you that even here, light still appears in modest and meaningful ways, never flooding the darkness, only touching it lightly, the way a whisper touches air. On the seabed itself, pale holothurians, the sea cucumbers of the deep, continue their humble work, processing sediment and returning nutrients to the ecosystem, while polychaete worms tunnel softly below and tiny copepods hover in the boundary between water and floor, each creature contributing to a system so large and so quiet that it can seem almost imaginary, though it is very real and has persisted for ages beyond counting. Perhaps one of the most soothing facts of all is that much of the deep ocean runs on conservation, on careful use of energy, on bodies designed to wait, filter, drift, and make do. And in a world that often celebrates speed, the abyss offers another wisdom entirely, showing that a creature can thrive by slowing down enough to match its environment, by using less by resting longer, by trusting the next small arrival of food or current or chance. And so this sleep story becomes a gentle bedtime lesson without ever losing its softness. Because every deep-sea creature you meet seems to say the same thing in a different form. That quiet is not a gap in life, but one of its great habitats. That darkness can be a shelter, that pressure can shape grace, and that the most hidden places on earth are not empty at all, but tenderly inhabited by beings that flutter, filter, sway, anchor, glow, and endure. Now, as this nighttime story glides onward through the vast calm of the abyssal plain, you may let your thoughts settle like marine snow, slowly, softly, without effort. While the coral branches hold still in the current, the glass sponges filter the cold water, the sea pens bend and rise again, and the entire deep sea seems to breathe in a rhythm so low and steady that it invites you to do the same, to drift farther into this relaxing story, farther toward deep sleep, farther into the quiet company of deep-sea creatures, whose oldest talent may simply be this: teaching the dark how to feel gentle. By now, this sleep story has carried you so gently into the deep that the ocean no longer feels like a place you are visiting, but a place that has slowly, softly accepted you. And as this bedtime story continues, you drift over an older part of the seafloor where the sediment gives way to scattered stone, coral branches, and low outcrops that rise from the abyss like forgotten garden walls. All of it washed in the same cold darkness, all of it resting beneath a pressure so immense that it would seem unbearable to the surface world. Yet here below it has become simply another form of stillness, another condition of life, another quiet rule long ago woven into the bodies of deep-sea creatures. Along these rocky places, delicate basket stars perch with their many curling arms lifted into the current. And when they open themselves to feed, they resemble tiny underwater trees made of lace and patience, filtering the passing water for edible particles in a posture so serene that it seems almost ceremonial, while nearby feather stars anchor and release, hold and sway as if practicing a movement so slow it can only be understood by those who have given up all need to hurry. This is one of the most comforting truths of the deep, that many creatures here do not chase very much at all, but instead wait wisely, gather gently, and trust the current to deliver what it can. And perhaps that is why this relaxing story feels so suited to the hour, because the ocean below offers a version of life arranged around conservation, quiet timing, and rest. Here and there on the rocky floor are deep-sea anemones, pale and soft-bodied, opening their tentacles like underwater flowers in perpetual twilight. And though they may seem simple, they are wonderfully adapted to a world where food arrives slowly, and the current becomes both messenger and provider, while tiny crustaceans move among the coral branches, nearly translucent, almost invisible, each one living a life of minute adjustments, careful feeding, and calm persistence. On a ledge just ahead, a rattlefish, also called a grenadier, glides past with its large head and tapering tail, its movement untroubled and exact. And though it belongs to a family common in the deep, there is nothing ordinary about how perfectly such fish fit this world. With bodies designed for dark water, low temperatures, and the long spaces between meals. And even that, too, feels soothing in a nighttime story like this one, because the deep sea rewards moderation, never excess, and asks each living thing to use only the energy it truly needs. If you look farther into the dimness, you may imagine a soft pink sea pig, a kind of deep-sea sea cucumber, moving over the sediment on little tube feet, not quickly, never dramatically, but with a gentle determination that makes it seem almost dreamlike. And despite its playful name, its life is humble and useful, helping recycle organic matter on the ocean floor, one small mouthful at a time, while around it, tiny worms and amphipods continue their own nearly invisible labor beneath the drifting fall of marine snow. Some of the creatures in this part of the deep have bodies that appear almost transparent, and there is a quiet elegance in that, as though the ocean has sculpted them from water itself, keeping only the faintest outline of form, and among them are certain shrimps and gelatinous drifters that seem less like animals than slow thoughts passing through the current, reminding you that the sea does not always draw its creations with sharp lines, but often with softness, translucence, and light restraint. This is also a place where bioluminescence still appears, though never wastefully, and perhaps a tiny crustacean flashes for a brief instant, or a distant siphonophore threads the darkness with a line of dim blue lights, not enough to disturb the calm, only enough to suggest that even here, in this immense black quiet, life continues to make its own subtle stars on steeper stones. Cold water corals keep building their branching forms, grain by grain and year by year, not with the bright exuberance of shallow reefs, but with the quiet commitment of things that understand time differently. And among their branches, small fishes shelter, brittle stars coil, and minute life gathers in numbers far greater than the eye can comfortably count, proving once again that the deep ocean is not empty wilderness, but a patient, working community, vast yet intimate, sparse yet full. As this gentle bedtime passage goes on, you may notice how every deep-sea fact becomes less like information and more like a rhythm, because to hear that a basket star waits in the current, that a sea pig sifts the seafloor, that a grenadier glides above stone, that coral grows slowly in darkness, is to feel the same soothing pattern repeated in many forms, the pattern of enoughness, of creatures doing only what their world asks of them and no more. And if your thoughts are beginning to blur pleasantly around the edges now, that is perfectly welcome, because this sleep story was never meant to be grasped tightly, only floated through the way one drifts through cold, dark water without resistance. And so the abyss continues beneath and around you, calm as velvet, while the coral holds its stillness. The anemones remain open to the passing current, the basket stars gather what the sea sends, and the entire hidden landscape seems to murmur the same gentle instruction again and again, to soften, to slow, to trust the dark, to follow the current downward into deep sleep, where every creature of the midnight ocean keeps moving in its own quiet way, and nothing at all needs to be done except rest. Continuity log, current setting, a deeper abyssal region of scattered rock, cold water coral, anemones, and slow-moving seafloor life. Narrator's distance, approximately 2450 meters beneath the imagined sea surface. Story time. The descent has become a calm horizontal drift across older abyssal terrain, with the listener now fully immersed in the slow routines of the deep. As this sleep story drifts onward through the deep, the ocean floor changes again with such gentleness that you may barely notice it at first. Because the darkness remains soft and the water remains cold and still, yet ahead of you, the seabed begins to shimmer with a different kind of life. One gathered around places where the earth quietly releases warmth and minerals into the sea. And in this bedtime story, these hidden habitats do not feel harsh or dramatic, but almost tender, like sheltered garden paths lit from below by the oldest chemistry on the planet. Here, in the calm presence of hydrothermal vents and cold seeps, deep-sea creatures have learned to live without depending directly on sunlight. And that fact alone can feel wonderfully soothing, because it reminds us that life is far more flexible and patient than the waking mind often remembers. Able to find nourishment in darkness, able to begin again around stone, heat, and mineral-rich water, able to build whole communities in places once thought too remote for comfort. Around some of these openings, tube worms rise in clusters like soft white candles tipped with muted crimson. And though they have no mouths in the usual sense, they live through a close partnership with bacteria inside their bodies, microbes that turn chemicals from the vent water into energy, which means that even here, miles beneath the sea, life continues through cooperation, through quiet exchange, through an intimacy so complete that animal and microbe become a shared act of survival. Nearby, vent mussels gather in pale beds on the rock, and they too may shelter helpful bacteria, while vent shrimp move through the warmened water in restless, but still delicate little currents, sensing their environment with fine antennae, and gathering close to the places where chemistry can sustain them. And even this busier patch of the deep retains a dreamlike softness in your mind, because nothing here rushes in the way the surface does, and every motion is absorbed by dark water almost as soon as it begins. Farther along the seafloor are cold seeps, where methane and sulfide seep slowly from beneath the sediments. And these places, despite their name, support their own calm communities of clams, worms, and bacteria-fed life, as if the earth were breathing very slowly through the seabed, offering small exhalations that become nourishment over time. And perhaps that is why this relaxing story can feel so grounding now, because the deep ocean is showing you a world where even the hidden breath of stone can feed a neighborhood of living things. If you imagine hovering there a little longer, you might notice how the creatures in these vent and seep habitats are not isolated oddities, but parts of complete ecosystems, with tiny grazers moving over bacterial mats, crabs stepping among mineral chimneys, and fish passing quietly at the edge of the warmth, each one occupying a place in a web so ancient and serene that it seems almost ceremonial, a midnight routine repeated over and over beneath the waves. There is a particularly peaceful fact in this too, that many deep-sea animals depend on microbes, and many microbes depend on chemistry rising from the earth. So the ocean below becomes a place where life is braided together across scales, from invisible cells to swaying worms, from mineral seep to drifting fish. And as your own thoughts soften in this gentle bedtime narration, the whole arrangement may begin to feel less like a set of scientific details and more like a lullaby about connection. Just beyond the vent field, the darkness opens again into cooler water, and a deep-sea octopus settles near the rocks, its body pale and velvety, its arms folding and unfolding with the quiet intelligence of an animal perfectly at home in pressure and cold. While above it, a faint cloud of marine snow continues to descend from distant upper waters, linking this warm seafloor garden to the broader ocean above, reminding you that even the most isolated places are still part of a larger slow circulation. Some vent chimneys, built over time from minerals precipitating out of the heated water, stand like dark towers or soft columns, and in a more hurried story, they might seem imposing. But here, they can simply be understood as underwater architecture, patiently constructed by geologic process, then inhabited by worms, limpets, shrimp, and bacteria, until stone and life become almost inseparable. And as this nighttime story moves you gently onward, it becomes easier and easier to sense the great calm beneath all of it. The unspoken rhythm shared by tube worms, mussel beds, seep clams, and drifting fish. A rhythm of persistence rather than speed, of adaptation rather than struggle, of quiet flourishing in unlikely places. Perhaps that is one of the most restful deep-sea facts of all, that life does not always need brightness to thrive, and that in the most hidden corners of the earth, entire communities can form around subtle sources of energy, around warmth in the dark, around chemistry slowly rising through stone, and continue there for years and centuries with no audience at all. Content simply to exist. Now the water around you feels heavier in the most comforting way, like a cool blanket settling into place. And the vent field behind you begins to dim again into the larger midnight sea. While the last pale tube worms sway softly, the mussels remain clustered in their mineral beds. The shrimp keep to their warm currents, and your own thoughts drift farther from the surface world, deeper into this calming narration, deeper into the tender darkness where deep-sea creatures live by patience, by partnership, by ancient chemistry, and by the quiet certainty that even far below the sun, the world still knows how to cradle life and carry it gently toward rest. In this sleep story, your descent continues so softly that it almost feels like the ocean itself is lowering you by hand. And as this bedtime story carries you farther from the warm breathing gardens behind you, the seafloor begins to slope into a deeper valley, a broad trench-like hush where the water grows even stiller, and the darkness takes on a velvety depth, not empty, but full of hidden lives moving with the patience of old thoughts. And here, in this nighttime story, everything seems arranged for rest, for slow observation, for the kind of relaxing story that lets the mind loosen its grip and drift along the slope. The sediment is fine and pale in places, darker in others, and small tracks mark the passage of creatures that crossed here long before your imagination arrived. while above the bottom there hover transparent drifters, gelatinous animals so light and fragile that they seem made from the ocean's own breath. And among them are ctenophores, the comb jellies, whose rows of beating cilia catch what little light there is and turn it into soft, shifting rainbows, not because the deep asks for decoration, but because even here, motion can become beauty without effort. A little farther down the trench wall, a dumbo octopus rises from the seafloor and paddles gently into the water, its ear-like fins moving with such calm grace that it barely seems to swim at all. And this is one of the most soothing facts the deep offers, that one of its most beloved creatures does not dart or rush, but glides, pulses, and drifts as if it has understood something essential about conserving energy and moving only as much as the moment requires. Nearby, snailfish inhabit these pressure-heavy depths with remarkable softness, their bodies flexible and delicate, their bones reduced, their tissues adapted for a world that would crush more rigid forms. And there is a quiet lesson in that too, because the trench rewards not hardness, but yielding, not force, but fit. And in a gentle bedtime meditation like this one, that truth can feel wonderfully comforting as you drift deeper into this calming narration. A line of faint lights appears in the water before fading again. Perhaps a siphonophore stretching through the dark like a living necklace, each tiny unit part of a colony, working together so seamlessly that they create the illusion of a single, long, luminous being. And this deep-sea fact is especially lovely to rest beside, that in the quietest parts of the world, cooperation can become so complete that many lives move as one. On the floor of the trench itself, amphipods gather where food has settled, little crustaceans patient enough to make a living from what descends from above, while sea cucumbers continue their humble work over the sediment, processing the seabed grain by grain, and all around them, marine snow keeps falling in tiny, almost invisible flecks, as though the upper ocean were dreaming downward into the abyss. There are also soft corals here in scattered clusters, and brittle stars with thin arms spread like fine branches. And from time to time, a rattlefish passes overhead in a calm, measured glide, its body perfectly suited to long distances and dim spaces, while farther out in the black, water a jelly with trailing filaments pulses once, then again, then seems to pause inside the dark itself. And every one of these creatures contributes to the same great lullaby of the deep, where no motion is wasted and no sound carries far. Perhaps the trench feels especially peaceful because its scale is difficult for the waking mind to hold. Its walls broad and shadowed, its floor quiet and remote. And once the mind stops trying to measure it, the whole place becomes something softer, a cradle of pressure and cold where life persists in delicate forms, where glowing signals replace shouting, where drifting replaces striving, and where even the strangest bodies belong completely. One of the gentlest facts about deep-sea creatures is that many survive by slowing down, by using little energy, by eating opportunistically, by waiting with infinite patience for the next edible particle or passing animal. And in that sense, the trench is not a place of urgency, but of exquisite thrift, a world where every movement matters and stillness is a form of wisdom. Now and then, just at the edge of your awareness, a small bioluminescent flash blooms and vanishes, perhaps from a shrimp, perhaps from a jelly, perhaps from some tiny being too delicate to name in passing. And those little lanterns never disturb the peace of this sleep story, because they are not bright enough to wake the sea, only enough to remind you that life continues to glow in modest ways even here. And as this relaxing story settles around you, you may feel your own thoughts becoming more trench-like, deeper, quieter, broader, with fewer sharp edges and less need to rise to the surface, while the dumbo octopus folds itself once more toward the bottom. The comb jellies turn movement into soft light. The amphipods keep to their patient work, and the great dark valley of the ocean receives everything with the same calm acceptance, holding each creature, each drifting particle, each fading thought, until this nighttime story becomes less a journey than a gentle suspension, a slow underwater rocking that carries you farther toward deep sleep, farther toward stillness, farther into the velvet trench where the lanterns are small, the creatures are quiet, and the darkness itself feels kind. As this sleep story continues, in the same calm, serialized cadence established by your sample, you drift beyond the trench wall and nearer to the Hadal floor itself, where the ocean becomes so deep and so hushed that even the idea of distance seems to soften at the edges. And in this bedtime story, the darkness does not feel empty or severe, but tender, like a vast, cool blanket laid carefully over the oldest sleeping places on Earth, while below you the trench bottom stretches out in smooth folds of sediment, pale in some places, darker in others, shaped by slow settling and slower time. And here at last, you enter a world where deep-sea creatures live beneath almost unimaginable pressure with such steady grace that the whole place feels less like an extreme environment and more like a secret lesson in how to be quiet. On this deep seafloor, life becomes exquisitely economical. Every movement considered, every body adapted to a world where food arrives gently from above, or appears only in rare and welcome moments. And so the Hadal animals do not waste themselves in urgency, but rest, wait, sift, hover, and feed with a patience that suits a nighttime story perfectly, while snailfish move through these depths with their soft bodies and flexible structures, seeming almost too delicate for such crushing water, yet thriving here precisely because they are yielding rather than rigid. And in their calm little passage over the trench floor, there is something profoundly soothing, as if the deepest sea is quietly reminding you that softness can survive where stiffness cannot. Around them, amphipods gather in the sediment or rise briefly into the water when something edible arrives. Tiny crustaceans living out their careful scavenging lives in the coldest dark. And near them, sea cucumbers continue their ancient, humble task of processing the seafloor, one gentle mouthful at a time, never hurrying, never pausing in alarm, simply moving over the mud like small, thoughtful custodians of the abyss, while marine snow still falls even here, though thinner now, a sparse downward drift of the upper world arriving after an impossibly long descent, each tiny particle proof that nothing in the ocean is truly separate, that even the deepest trench remains linked by gravity and time to waters far above. In some quiet patches of this Hadal plain, xenophyophores rest on the sediment, giant, single-celled organisms making intricate forms from the materials around them, and their presence lends the trench floor an almost dreamlike quality, because it is hard for the waking mind to imagine a single cell becoming something so large and structured. Yet the deep asks for no dramatic explanation, only patience, only the willingness to let unfamiliar life be gentle as well as strange. And nearby delicate worms thread invisibly through the mud. Brittle stars lift their arms like fine branches in the current, and tiny copepods hover in the boundary between seafloor and water, as though suspended in the pause between breaths. If you drift onward a little farther in this relaxing story, you may notice how sound itself seems to have retreated, not because the ocean is truly silent, but because everything here happens with such restraint that the imagination hears mostly softness, the faint settling of particles, the almost unfelt passage of current, the slow contact of creature and sediment. And perhaps this is why the Hadal zone can feel so comforting in a calming narration, because it strips life down to essentials without making it harsh, leaving only the quiet rhythms that matter most: feeding, drifting, waiting, conserving, continuing. From time to time, a gelatinous drifter passes in the water above, transparent and wavering, like a thought too light to touch the bottom. And farther off, a faint bioluminescent point appears and fades, one small lantern in the pressure-heavy dark, not bright enough to disturb your drowsiness, only enough to remind you that even in the deepest trench, life still makes modest use of light, still offers tiny signals, still glows only when necessary, and then allows the darkness to close gently around it again. It may help to imagine that the trench floor is not barren at all, but carefully inhabited, a long sleeping valley tended by creatures who have mastered stillness, where amphipods arrive like brief whispers, where sea cucumbers cross the mud like slow handwriting, where snailfish glide low over the ground as if reading the landscape, and where every drifting particle of nourishment is welcomed without fuss, without competition loud enough to reach the surface world. There's something deeply restful in this pattern, because the Hadal deep does not reward excess. It rewards adaptation, thrift, and calm. And so the entire trench begins to feel like a lullaby composed of pressure and patience, a hidden place where living things remain untroubled by brightness, by crowds, by clocks, and by all the busy measures of ordinary day. Now, as your thoughts loosen further and your breathing becomes slower and more even, you can let the ocean carry you a little closer to the floor without ever landing too heavily, just hovering in the cool dark above the sediment while the xenophyophores hold their quiet shapes. The sea cucumbers continue their soft labor. The amphipods gather and disperse in tiny movements, and the whole Hadal plain rests under its great weight of water, like a sleeping world beneath another sleeping world, so that this bedtime story no longer feels like a descent at all, but like being gently held in the deepest cradle the planet has made, where the silence below silence is not lonely, but kind, and where the hidden lives of deep-sea creatures continue with such serene certainty that it becomes easier and easier to follow them, softly, steadily, all the way toward deep sleep. As this sleep story moves onward through the deepest quiet, it carries the same gentle, drifting rhythm established by your sample. And now, your bedtime story hovers just above the Hadal floor, where the water is so calm and the darkness so complete that every tiny movement seems softened before it can fully begin. And in this nighttime story, the great trench no longer feels distant or strange, but familiar in the way a darkened room becomes familiar after your eyes and mind have rested long enough within it, because the deep ocean has a way of replacing wonder with comfort, replacing scale with softness, and teaching the listener that even the most hidden places on Earth can become a relaxing story when approached slowly enough. Above you and around you, marine snow continues its endless descent, that delicate shower of organic particles drifting down from far shallower waters. And here in the deep, it looks almost like a slow underwater snowfall, sparse and patient, and wonderfully untroubled feeding creatures that have learned to live on what the ocean quietly offers rather than what they can quickly pursue. And perhaps this is one of the loveliest facts of all to fall asleep beside, that the deep sea is nourished not by sudden abundance, but by a constant, gentle settling. A soft delivery from the world above that arrives flake by flake through miles of darkness. Beneath this downward drift, sea cucumbers move over the sediment with their usual calm devotion, taking in the uppermost layer of the seafloor and sorting nourishment from the fine mud. And in doing so, they help recycle nutrients across the abyss, turning the Hadal plain into a place of slow renewal rather than stillness alone, while nearby tiny amphipods gather in little clusters and scatter again, each one no more dramatic than a brief thought, yet together forming part of a careful system that has gone on quietly for ages beyond counting. A little farther out in the water above the trench bottom, a transparent jelly pulses with such restraint that it seems not to swim, but to breathe, and close by a comb, jelly drifts through the black water, with its rows of cilia beating in coordinated waves, catching and bending the faintest traces of light into soft rainbow glimmers. And even though this place is almost entirely dark, the deep still finds gentle ways to shimmer, never enough to wake the mind, only enough to soothe it, as if the ocean itself understands the art of calming narration. Here and there, a pale snailfish passes low over the seafloor, its body flexible and tender-looking, better suited to pressure because it yields rather than resists. And that quiet biological truth feels especially welcome now, because in a world that often praises hardness, the deepest sea keeps offering examples of the opposite, creatures that survive by softness, by efficiency, by fitting their environment instead of fighting it. On a rise of sediment rests a xenophyophore, intricate and still, a giant single-celled life form shaped partly from the materials around it. And around its structure, smaller organisms find shelter in miniature shadows and folds, so that even here one being can become a resting place for others. And in this way, the Hadal floor remains not barren, but gently inhabited, a landscape of tiny relationships, subtle exchanges, and low, continuous lives. As your own breathing grows slower in this gentle bedtime passage, imagine the trench as a kind of underwater valley of sleep, where each creature carries out its work in almost complete silence, where drifting matters more than chasing, where waiting is not emptiness, but wisdom, and where even the falling food arrives with the softness of ash from a distant fire. Except here the fire is life itself, burning high above in brighter waters, and sending down its fine, cool remnants in the middle distance. A brittle star lifts its long arms into the current, gathering what passes, and not far away a holothurian settles more deeply into the mud before moving on again, while above them a faint bioluminescent spark appears and disappears, perhaps from some tiny crustacean or gelatinous drifter too delicate to name in the dark. And those little lanterns seem almost courteous here, glowing only briefly, only modestly, as if they too understand that this is a place for rest. The farther this bedtime story carries you, the more the trench begins to feel like a patient rhythm rather than a location. A deep, repeating hush of sediment, snowfall, drifting jellies, soft scavengers, and low glimmers, all of it wrapped in cold water that presses from every side, not as a burden in this story, but as a blanket, firm and surrounding, and strangely reassuring. And so you continue to hover without effort, held in the immense quiet, while marine snow falls through the water column above you. The snailfish glides near the floor. The amphipods keep to their tiny gatherings. The sea cucumbers continue their calm and useful wandering. And the whole hidden world remains devoted to the same serene pattern, taking only what comes, moving only when needed, glowing only in brief whispers, until your mind begins to imitate the trench itself, wide and dark and untroubled, ready to drift deeper into this sleep story, deeper into this relaxing story, deeper into the soft and steady peace, where deep-sea creatures live beneath the silence and teach the body, little by little, how to let go, how to soften, and how to follow the slow river of marine snow all the way into deep sleep. Now, in this sleep story, the trench has grown so familiar that it no longer feels like a place far from the world, but a hidden room beneath it, a vast and gentle chamber of water where everything has learned to move softly. And as this bedtime story continues, you drift a little farther along the Hadal plain, not descending so much now as gliding through a depth already deep enough to quiet every hurried thought, while the darkness around you remains velvety and whole, never harsh, never empty, only spacious and cool, like a blanket spread across the oldest floor of the sea. Here the sediment lies in smooth, pale stretches, and over it marine snow still falls in a soft and constant whisper. Tiny flakes from the upper ocean settling through miles of black water, until they reach this quiet world below, and as they descend they feed creatures that have built their entire lives around patience, around receiving, around the art of waiting without strain, which is why this relaxing story can feel so restful now, because every deep-sea creature around you seems to understand that there is wisdom in stillness and comfort in enoughness. Ahead of you, a field of delicate sea lilies and feather stars begins to rise from the seafloor. Their many arms spread into the slow current like fine underwater ferns. And although some are anchored, while others can move when they wish, they all seem to belong to the same serene design, gathering passing nourishment from the water with no urgency at all, opening themselves to what comes. And in their feathery silhouettes, there is something almost ceremonial, as though the trench itself were breathing through them in long, quiet breaths. Between these soft living forms, tiny brittle stars rest with their arms coiled or extended, while pale crustaceans step carefully over the mud. And not far away, a sea cucumber crosses the plain with its usual gentle certainty, processing the sediment one calm mouthful at a time, leaving behind the faintest track, a line so subtle it seems less like movement and more like memory. Above this tranquil garden, a transparent jelly pulses once and then again, and each pulse is so slow that it feels like part of the water rather than a separate action, while nearby, a comb jelly drifts through the dark, with its rows of cilia shimmering in fleeting rainbows, turning the little available light into something soft and passing, never bright enough to break the spell of this nighttime story, only enough to remind you that beauty in the deep is often quiet, almost private, offered without display. Farther out, where the trench plain opens into wider darkness, a snailfish glides close to the bottom, its tender body perfectly suited to this pressure-heavy world. And that remains one of the deep sea's most soothing truths, that life here is often successful because it yields, because it becomes supple, because it meets the world as it is rather than trying to overpower it. And so, the deepest creatures are not always armored or forceful, but soft, efficient, and astonishingly calm. From time to time, an amphipod flickers through the near dark, like a tiny thought crossing the mind before sleep. And in small clusters, they gather where nourishment has settled, each one living a brief and busy little life within the larger stillness of the trench, while xenophyophores rest nearby on the sediment in intricate, quiet forms, offering miniature shelter to smaller beings, and reminding you again that even a single-celled life can become part of the architecture of this hidden plane if you listen with the imagination rather than the ears. The Hadal world seems full of softened rhythms, the settling of particles, the almost imperceptible brush of current through feathered arms, the muted passage of drifting gelatinous life overhead. And perhaps that is why the deep is such a natural setting for a gentle bedtime narration, because it is a place where nothing insists, where everything persists quietly instead, where survival itself has become a slow and elegant practice. In this part of the trench, there is no need for brightness, no need for sudden movement, no need for noise, and the creatures seem beautifully content with that arrangement, feeding when food arrives, conserving when it does not, glowing only in brief whispers if they glow at all, and letting the cold water hold them in a steady pressure that, in this sleep story, feels less like weight and more like reassurance. Now the feather stars sway slightly as the current passes. The brittle stars remain poised like little star-shaped thoughts upon the mud. The sea cucumber moves onward with untroubled purpose, and the marine snow continues its endless downward drift, each tiny flake joining the Hadal plain in silence. And as you hover among these deep-sea creatures, your own mind may begin to imitate their rhythm, spreading out, slowing down, taking only what it needs, letting the rest settle harmlessly away, until this bedtime story becomes softer than language, calmer than thought, a long underwater exhale moving through the deepest sleeping garden of the sea, where feathered arms gather the dark, transparent drifters pulse like dreams, and the whole trench seems to cradle you in its ancient, measured stillness, carrying you farther and farther toward deep sleep without effort, without interruption, and without end. As this sleep story glides farther along the deepest plain, the Hadal dark seems softer than ever now, less like an absence of light, and more like a fabric gently wrapped around the slowest living things. And in this bedtime story, you move without effort through cold water that presses close on every side like a steady blanket, while the trench floor below remains smooth and patient beneath its falling veil of marine snow. And the whole nighttime story feels increasingly dreamlike, not because it has left science behind, but because the science of the deep is so full of quiet adaptation, of careful energy, of creatures that survive by drifting, waiting, filtering, and glowing only in whispers, that it naturally becomes a relaxing story for anyone ready to fall asleep inside the calmest corners of the sea. One of the most soothing beings to meet here is the vampire squid, a creature with a dramatic name and a remarkably gentle way of living. Neither true squid nor octopus in the simplest sense, but a distant relative of both, cloaked in dark, velvety skin with webbing stretched between its arms. And when it drifts in the water, it looks less like a hunter from the dark and more like a soft umbrella, folding and unfolding in slow motion, a living lantern with no need to hurry, no need to waste energy, and no desire to disturb the silence that holds this deep sleep world together. The vampire squid is especially suited to waters with very little oxygen, a place where many other active animals would struggle. And that fact alone makes it feel like a perfect resident of this calming narration, because rather than fighting the deep sea's limitations, it simply fits them, using a low metabolism and gentle movements to live where the water is thin in breath, but rich in stillness. And in that way, it offers one of the deep ocean's most restful lessons, that survival can come through softness, through efficiency, through becoming quiet enough to belong exactly where you are. When food drifts by, the vampire squid does not usually chase it with force, but may gather bits of detritus and marine snow using long, delicate filaments, drawing in the ocean's tiny offerings as though collecting dust from a dream. And there is something almost impossibly peaceful in that image. This dark red creature suspended in the midnight water, patiently feeding on the gentle fall from above, making a life from what descends slowly through the sea, as if it has fully accepted the pace of the world around it and found nourishment in the softest things. Not far away in this same drifting quiet are giant larvaceans, transparent animals that build remarkable mucus houses around themselves, delicate balloon-like structures used to filter tiny particles from the water, and though the houses are fragile and temporary, they are marvels of design, invisible architecture made for gathering nourishment in a world where every particle matters. So that even here, in darkness, almost beyond imagination, an animal can survive by building a clear and floating home, resting inside it for a while, and letting the water bring sustenance close. When those larvation houses become clogged or torn, they are abandoned and sink slowly toward the seafloor, carrying trapped organic material downward, which means these ghostly structures help feed the deep by becoming part of the marine snow themselves. And perhaps that is one of the loveliest facts in this gentle bedtime passage, that even a discarded home can become nourishment for another creature below. As if the ocean has learned to turn every ending into a soft continuation, every letting go into one more way of giving. On the trench floor beneath these drifting houses, sea pigs, those tender little deep-sea sea cucumbers with rounded bodies and tube feet, move over the mud in their calm and curious way, while amphipods gather where edible particles settle, and together they turn the deep plain into a place of quiet recycling and renewal, not barren at all, but carefully inhabited, full of patient workers who sift, absorb, nibble, and carry on without spectacle, maintaining the hidden economy of the abyss, one tiny motion at a time. From time to time, a faint blue or green bioluminescent flicker appears somewhere out in the water, perhaps from a drifting jelly, perhaps from some small crustacean, perhaps from an unseen body too delicate to interrupt with a name. And those modest glows never break the spell of this sleep story, because they are brief and measured, like tiny underwater breaths of light, just enough to accompany the gentle bedtime rhythm of the trench, just enough to soften the dark without ever fully lifting it, so that the whole scene remains perfectly suited for deep sleep, for calming narration, for the long and slow descent of thought into rest. And now, as this nighttime story carries you onward through water filled with transparent houses, velvet drifters, marine snow, and soft-footed scavengers, you may feel your own mind becoming more oceanic, more willing to release what it no longer needs, more content to float with what arrives, and let the rest sink harmlessly away. While below you, the sea pigs continue their patient wandering. Above you, the larvation houses drift and fall, and somewhere nearby, the vampire squid folds its cloak around itself and hangs in the dark with perfect composure, as if showing you exactly how to do the same, how to gather the quiet close, how to slow every inner current, and how to follow this relaxing story down into a place so still, so sheltered, and so softly alive that falling asleep feels less like leaving consciousness and more like joining the deep sea in its oldest, gentlest art of all, the art of resting without resistance. As this sleep story continues its long and gentle drift through the deepest reaches of the ocean, the darkness around you seems to grow softer rather than deeper, as though the trench has learned your breathing and is now moving in time with it. And in this bedtime story, there is no longer any feeling of descent or distance, only the calm sensation of being carried through cool water that holds every thought in suspension until it becomes light enough to float away. while below you, the Hadal floor remains smooth and pale beneath its snowfall of drifting particles. And above you, the open water stretches upward into endless night, where deep-sea creatures appear like brief ideas made visible, and then, just as softly, disappear again here in the breathing dark. One of the loveliest facts to rest beside is that many gelatinous animals of the deep are nearly transparent, their bodies so clear and delicate that they seem less like solid beings and more like shapes the sea has made from patience, and among them are glass squid and other translucent drifters whose tissues reveal only the faintest suggestion of form, reminding you that some life in the abyss survives not by hiding behind heaviness, but by becoming almost weightless in appearance, almost invisible in motion, almost pure water given the gentlest possible intention. A little farther out, perhaps just at the edge of your imagination, a siphonophore stretches in a long luminous thread, not one creature in the simplest sense, but a colony of many small bodies working together so seamlessly that they drift as if sharing a single dream. And there is something deeply calming in that arrangement, because the deep ocean so often replaces competition with coordination, showing again and again that even in profound darkness, life can arrange itself into cooperation, specialization, and exquisite calm. Along the trench floor, the marine snow continues to fall in its slow river from above, and where it settles, amphipods gather in patient little clusters, while sea cucumbers move steadily through the soft mud, processing the thin layer of nourishment that has taken so long to arrive. And each of these creatures lives within the same beautiful economy of the abyss, where food is precious, energy is conserved, and every action seems reduced to its most essential and peaceful form. Not far from them, a brittle star raises its arms into a passing current, and nearby, a feathered crinoid opens itself like a living fern, gathering particles from the water without ever seeming to break the silence. And their movements are so delicate that they might almost be mistaken for the trench itself breathing, for the ocean floor gently lifting and settling in some ancient half-sleep. As this relaxing story carries you onward, a faint pulse of blue-green light appears above, then another, then fades into the black, perhaps from a jelly, perhaps from a comb, jelly turning movement into shimmer, perhaps from a tiny drifting organism using a brief flash for communication or defense. And in this calming narration, those glimmers do not startle the dark, but soften it, like tiny lanterns dimmed for bedtime, offering just enough light to reassure the mind before disappearing back into the velvet water. One of the most restful truths about these deep-sea lights is that they are often efficient rather than extravagant, used briefly, carefully, only when needed. And in that way, they belong perfectly to this nighttime story, where nothing is wasted and even brightness arrives with restraint. Through the middle water, a transparent larvation house drifts downward, abandoned now, carrying trapped particles toward the plain below. And as it sinks, it resembles a little glass room falling through a sleeping world, a reminder that in the deep ocean, even discarded structures continue to matter, continue to feed, continue to become part of some other life's quiet tomorrow. Nearby, a gelatinous salp or drifting colony passes in slow succession, each body linked to the next in a chain of softness, filtering the water as it goes. And their presence makes the trench feel fuller somehow, not crowded, but gently inhabited, like a dim sky filled with moving constellations that ask nothing from you except your willingness to rest among them. The farther this sleep story goes, the more the deep sea seems to offer the same serene lesson in different forms, that life can be transparent and still endure, that it can glow only for a moment and still be known, that it can survive by filtering, drifting, gathering, yielding, and waiting. And perhaps that is why your thoughts now feel slower and less solid too, because the creatures around you have been quietly teaching the body and mind how to soften, how to take up less effort, how to live for a while inside a lower, calmer rhythm. And so you keep hovering in the breathing dark, while the glass lanterns of the sea appear and fade above you. The siphonophores trail their living threads through the water. The larvation houses descend in patient silence, and the Hadal floor below continues its humble work of receiving, sifting, and renewing, until this bedtime story becomes almost wordless in feeling, a long underwater hush where nothing needs to be solved and nothing needs to rise again, only the soft pulse of drifting life, the quiet fall of marine snow, and the vast, cool kindness of the trench carrying you farther into deep sleep, where every transparent creature, every brief light, and every slow current seems to whisper the same gentle invitation to become lighter, softer, quieter, and at last to rest, as this sleep story continues in the same slow and welcoming rhythm. Your bedtime journey remains gentle and unhurried, letting the deep ocean open around you like a quiet room prepared for rest. Now the Hadal dark feels so familiar that even its vastness seems cozy. And in this nighttime story, you drift over a broad seafloor garden where life is sparse, but beautifully arranged, not in bright crowds, but in soft intervals, in patient distances, in the kind of calm spacing that makes every creature seem as if it has been placed with care. Here the sediment rises in low folds and settles again into smooth plains, and along those dim contours live anemones with pale, flower-like crowns, sea cucumbers tracing slow paths through the mud, brittle stars resting like delicate sketches upon the ground, and small worms hidden beneath the surface, each one living a life so quiet that it almost merges with the stillness itself. If you imagine gliding only a little lower, not enough to touch the bottom, just enough to feel close to it, you may notice that the trench floor is not lifeless at all, but softly inhabited by creatures whose greatest skill is not speed or force, but endurance, thrift, and grace. And perhaps that is why this relaxing story grows more soothing the deeper it goes, because the deep sea keeps offering the same reassuring message in different forms, that life does not need to be loud in order to be full, and it does not need to be hurried in order to continue. Ahead of you, a cluster of sea pens rises from the sediment like feathered quills planted in moonless snow, their bodies anchored below, and their softer branches lifting upward into the current. And when the water moves through them, they bend only slightly, never struggling, only yielding, which feels like one of the gentlest lessons of the ocean, that sometimes the most peaceful way to remain standing is to sway a little with what passes through. Nearby, a deep-sea holothurian, soft and translucent around the edges, continues its untroubled crossing of the plain, collecting nourishment from the surface of the mud one careful mouthful at a time. And not far away, tiny amphipods gather where the drifting marine snow has settled more thickly, each minute particle becoming useful, each fragment welcomed, until the whole seafloor seems to participate in a quiet exchange where nothing is wasted, and everything, eventually, becomes part of some other life. Above this muted garden, a transparent jelly drifts with a pulse so slow it seems almost imaginary. And farther back in the water, a comb jelly catches a faint glimmer and turns it into a brief ribbon of rainbow light, not enough to brighten the deep, only enough to soften it for a moment. And these small, luminous appearances suit this calming narration perfectly, because they never insist on being seen. They simply arrive, shimmer, and fade, like thoughts that visit gently just before sleep, somewhere beyond the edge of your awareness, perhaps half hidden in the black water. A siphonophore extends in a long living thread, its many tiny bodies arranged into one drifting colony. And the idea of that quiet cooperation feels especially restful here, because the deeper the ocean becomes, the more life seems to rely on elegant partnerships, on specialization, on each part doing only what it must and nothing more. The seafloor below remains covered in a fine and constant descent of marine snow, a slow weather from the upper ocean. And as it falls, it softens the whole scene, settling over tracks, over shells, over ridges in the mud, over the patient forms of creatures that know how to wait. And by now, your own mind may be doing something similar, allowing thoughts to settle gently rather than circle, allowing the day to drift down into quiet layers where it no longer needs to be held. There is a soft beauty in imagining that even here, under immense pressure and many miles of water, the deep-sea world remains not only alive, but tender in its own way, full of flower-like animals that are not flowers, glowing beings that do not burn, transparent drifters that seem woven from water, and slow-moving custodians of the seabed that spend their lives turning what falls into what can continue. And in a bedtime story like this one, all of those facts become more than information. They become a lullaby about gentleness hidden inside extremity, about quiet thriving in the oldest dark. Now the current passes lightly over the sea pens. The brittle stars remain still in their star-shaped patience. The jelly pulses once more in the middle water, and the ocean around you feels so steady, so cushioned, and so untroubled that it becomes easy to imagine yourself not just observing the deep, but resting with it, suspended in cool water, while the trench floor keeps its soft and ancient routines below. And as this sleep story carries you onward, farther through the moonless garden of the seafloor, every creature seems to move in a language of calm. Every drifting particle seems to belong exactly where it lands, and every slow motion of the deep invites your breathing to lengthen, your thoughts to loosen, and your whole inner world to become quieter, softer, and sleepier, until this gentle bedtime descent feels less like listening and more like floating inside the ocean's oldest dream. as this sleep story continues through the deepest and gentlest darkness of the ocean. Your bedtime journey drifts into a place where time itself seems to soften, where minutes no longer feel sharp, and where the lives of deep-sea creatures unfold with such patience that even the idea of waiting becomes peaceful. And in this nighttime story, you move above a broad plain of still sediment and scattered stone, with the cold water around you holding every motion in slow suspension, while marine snow continues to descend in its thin, endless hush, feeding the quiet floor below, and reminding you that the deep sea is never truly empty, only subtle, only soft, only so calm that life must be noticed the way one notices breathing in the dark. Here, among rocks dusted with settling particles, there is one of the most comforting deep-sea truths of all, that some octopus mothers in the deep have been known to guard their eggs for astonishingly long periods, resting over them in a still and watchful posture for years at a time. And when you imagine that devotion here, in this low and moonless world, it does not feel lonely or severe, but tender, as though the deep ocean itself has made room for a kind of motherhood measured not in haste, but in patience, so complete that it becomes part of the landscape. Picture, if you like, a pale deep-sea octopus tucked gently against a rocky surface, her arms curved around a cluster of pearly eggs, her body almost unmoving, except for the faintest adjustments as the current passes, and all around her the trench remains hushed, the water cold and steady, the particles drifting down like a soft snowfall, while she keeps her quiet vigil in one of the most restful acts nature has ever composed, not chasing, not wandering, not calling out, simply staying, simply sheltering, simply letting time flow over her like dark water over stone. Nearby, small amphipods continue their delicate foraging, gathering where food has settled, and brittle stars rest with their arms spread lightly over the mud, while a sea cucumber moves along the seafloor in its untroubled way, turning the upper layer of sediment into nourishment and renewal. And all of these creatures seem to understand the same gentle principle, that the deep does not ask for drama, only continuation, only careful use of energy, only trust in the slow arrival of what is needed. Above the plain, a transparent jelly drifts by with a pulse so soft it seems less like swimming and more like a thought passing through sleep. And farther out in the water, a comb jelly catches a glimmer and lets it travel along its rows of cilia in a faint rainbow shimmer, a moving thread of color so brief and delicate that it feels like a kindness rather than a display. And then the dark closes around it again, not with emptiness, but with composure. There are little snailfish here too, gliding low above the bottom, with bodies built for pressure through softness and flexibility. And they offer the same soothing lesson again, that in the deepest places on Earth, life often survives by yielding, by fitting, by becoming gentle enough to belong completely to its surroundings, while on small rises in the sediment xenophyophores keep their intricate quiet forms, sheltering even tinier beings in folds and miniature shadows, proving that the Hadal floor remains a neighborhood of subtle lives and quiet exchanges. As this relaxing story carries you farther into the soft current of sleep, it becomes easier to feel how different the deep ocean sense of time is from the world above. Because here growth can be slow, meals can be rare, motion can be minimal, and care can last for years without impatience. And perhaps that is why this part of the story feels especially calming, because it offers a world where waiting is not wasted, where stillness is not absence, and where a mother octopus can remain beside her eggs through the long dark, with a calm that seems almost beyond human thought, yet deeply understandable to the resting heart. Around the rocks, tiny crustaceans move in almost invisible paths, while sea pens farther off bend slightly in a passing current, and the marine snow keeps falling in a pattern so constant that it begins to feel like the ocean's own breathing. A gentle downward rhythm linking all the layers of the sea from brighter waters far above to this hidden cradle of pressure and cold. And now, as you hover in this deep and quiet place, the guarded eggs rest safely beneath their patient arms. The jellies drift through the middle water. The sea cucumber continues its slow, useful crossing, and the trench itself seems to settle even more completely into silence, holding every creature in a cool and steady embrace, until this bedtime story becomes almost weightless, almost wordless, a long underwater hush about devotion, softness, and the deep wisdom of moving very little when very little is needed. And as the dark water rocks you onward through the oldest sleeping chambers of the sea, you may let your own thoughts grow fewer and farther apart, like faint lights in the distance, while all around you the hidden lives of deep-sea creatures continue in their patient ways, guarding, drifting, filtering, gathering, and resting, as if the whole ocean were showing you how to do the same, how to loosen, how to wait without worry, how to be gently held by the dark, and how to follow the quiet mothers of the abyss all the way into deep sleep. As this sleep story continues through the quietest chambers of the ocean, your bedtime story drifts gently onward from the nursery stones and into a nearby stretch of the Hadal plain, where the seafloor rises just enough to hold clusters of ancient filter feeders. And in this nighttime story, the darkness remains tender and untroubled, the water cool and steady, the marine snow falling in such a soft and patient way that it seems less like food descending from above and more like the deep sea thinking in slow white flakes, settling little by little over stone, over sediment, over the calm bodies of creatures that have made whole lives from receiving what the water brings. Here, among scattered outcrops and low ridges dusted with drifting particles, glass sponges stand like pale crystal towers, delicate in appearance, yet beautifully suited to their world, their bodies supported by fine silica skeletons that catch the imagination as gently as frost on a window. And although they seem almost too fragile for the pressure that surrounds them, they remain upright and patient, filtering the cold water through their tissues and quietly gathering nourishment from whatever microscopic life and organic matter passes near. So that one of the loveliest facts in this relaxing story is that some of the deep sea's most serene residents live not by chasing anything at all, but by waiting, by filtering, by allowing the ocean itself to provide. Around the bases of these sponges, tiny crustaceans shelter in the folds and shadows, and little worms move through the sediment with nearly invisible grace, while a brittle star curls one arm around a rocky edge and lets the others rest in the current as if listening. And farther off, a pale sea cucumber continues its slow and useful crossing of the seafloor, processing the uppermost layer of mud one gentle mouthful at a time, never hurrying, never straining, simply participating in the deep ocean's old and soothing rhythm of recycling, renewal, and enoughness. If you imagine drifting a little closer, not touching, only hovering near these crystal-like structures, you may notice how still the whole garden feels, and yet how full it is, because deep-sea life is often most alive in subtle ways, in water passing through a sponge, in particles settling onto feeding arms, in tiny scavengers gathering where nourishment has collected, in a transparent larvation house sinking from the water above like a delicate abandoned lantern, carrying trapped bits of organic matter downward to become part of the trench's soft economy. And somehow, every one of these facts belongs perfectly to a calming narration, because they describe a world where nothing is wasted and almost nothing is loud. Nearby, cold water corals branch outward in small pale thickets from the harder rock, not bright and tropical, but cream-colored and quiet, growing slowly in darkness over long stretches of time. And among those branches, small shrimp shelter, minute life gathers, and the passing current leaves behind edible traces. So even here, deep below the reach of sunlight, the ocean still builds neighborhoods, still makes room for others, still arranges shelter in the dark with astonishing gentleness. A little above the seafloor, a transparent jelly pulses once, then drifts, and beside it, a comb jelly turns movement into a faint ribbon of rainbow shimmer that appears and disappears so delicately that it feels like a thought passing just before sleep, while somewhere farther out, a siphonophore extends through the water as a living thread, not one body, but many cooperating so seamlessly that they move as though sharing a single dream. And perhaps that is one of the deep ocean's most comforting lessons, that even here, where the world seems sparse and remote, life is full of quiet partnership, from bacterial symbioses to drifting colonies to the small communities gathered around a sponge or coral branch. In this gentle bedtime passage, the pressure of the water no longer feels immense, but protective, like a cool, weighted blanket holding every creature in place, and the Hadal plain itself feels less like an alien landscape and more like a moonless garden arranged for deep sleep, where the glass sponges stand in soft rows, the corals hold their slow branching shapes, the sea cucumbers write brief paths in the mud, and the marine snow keeps falling with such constancy that even your thoughts may begin to imitate it, descending more slowly now, settling more lightly, no longer circling with daytime effort. This is the quiet genius of so many deep-sea creatures, that they survive not by resisting every condition, but by fitting it with calm precision, by filtering when food is thin, by glowing only when needed, by building delicate houses that drift and feed others when abandoned, by growing slowly, by conserving, by waiting. And as this sleep story continues to carry you through their world, the science of their lives becomes inseparable from the feeling of rest, because every adaptation seems to whisper the same gentle bedtime instruction. Use only what you need. Soften where you can. Trust the slow current. Let the dark hold you, and so you remain here for a while among the crystal sponges and pale corals, while the drifting jellies pass through the middle water. The brittle star loosens one arm and settles another. The larvation house descends in silence, and the entire deep ocean keeps breathing in its patient way around you, until this nighttime story becomes softer than language and more like a long underwater exhale, a relaxing story in which every tower of sponge, every falling particle, and every hidden little shelter in the trench encourages you to fall asleep, to sink inward toward deep sleep, and to rest as quietly as the oldest houses of the sea, as this sleep story carries you onward through the deepest reaches of the ocean. Your bedtime story enters a stretch of the Hadal world that feels almost arranged for rest, a quiet place where the seafloor rises in soft terraces and low shelves, and where the water moves just enough to keep every delicate life form supplied with the faintest passing stream of nourishment, so that in this nighttime story, the trench no longer feels like a place of distance at all, but like an ancient underwater chamber where patience has become the most natural thing in the world. Here, the darkness is not harsh, only velvety, and the pressure is not something to fear in this relaxing story. Only the steady embrace that has shaped each creature into exactly what it needs to be. And before you, spread gently across the stone and sediment, are communities of filter feeders opening themselves to the current with the same calm trust again and again, as if the whole deep sea were singing a lullaby without sound. Pale anemones lift their soft crowns into the water, each tentacle drifting with such slow composure that it seems impossible to tell where the current ends and the creature begins, while nearby sea pens rise from the mud like feathered quills written into the seafloor, bending only slightly as the water passes through them, never resisting, only swaying with a kind of flexibility that makes this gentle bedtime world feel so soothing. Farther along the terrace, glass sponges stand in elegant clusters, their silica skeletons faint and crystalline in the dark, filtering the surrounding water with a patience so complete that they seem to have stepped outside ordinary time. And among their bases, tiny crustaceans shelter in miniature hollows, while little worms move through the sediment below, making a quiet use of every surface, every fold, every gentle deposit of organic matter. Above the seafloor, the marine snow continues its slow descent from upper waters far away, and by now it feels less like falling debris and more like a steady blessing, a fine drifting weather that feeds brittle stars, sea cucumbers, amphipods, and all the modest lives of the trench, one tiny flake at a time. And as you hover above this moonless garden, it may comfort you to remember that so much of the deep depends not on sudden abundance, but on the patient arrival of small things, and that perhaps rest itself works the same way, not as one dramatic event, but as a quiet accumulation of softer breaths, looser thoughts, and heavier eyelids. A transparent jelly drifts by with a pulse so slow that it resembles breathing more than swimming, And a little higher in the water, a comb jelly carries a faint ribbon of rainbow shimmer along its rows of cilia, not bright enough to disturb the darkness, only enough to make the deep feel tender for a moment before the light vanishes again. And beyond it, like a delicate thread suspended in sleep, a siphonophore extends through the water as one of the ocean's gentlest collaborations. Many tiny living parts moving as a single drifting form, each unit doing only what it must, each one contributing without urgency to the whole. On the seafloor below, a pale sea cucumber continues its calm and useful journey over the mud, sorting nourishment from sediment that has taken so long to arrive, while nearby brittle stars spread their arms into the current with quiet precision. And farther off, a small snailfish glides just above the plain, flexible and soft-bodied, perfectly suited to a world where yielding matters more than force. And this remains one of the deep ocean's kindest truths, that the creatures living under the greatest weight often survive not through hardness, but through gentleness, economy, and fit. Here and there along the terrace are low coral branches, pale and slow-growing, their forms built little by little in cold darkness over spans of time so long that they seem almost geological. And yet, between their quiet limbs, small lives gather: tiny shrimp, minute scavengers, hidden invertebrates, all of them turning these gradual structures into neighborhoods, into shelters, into homes that do not announce themselves, but simply continue as this calming narration lingers among them. The entire Hadal landscape begins to feel like a choir of stillness, not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening softly. The water moving, the filter feeders opening, the particles settling, the gel is pulsing, the little scavengers gathering and dispersing, each part of the deep sea contributing its own nearly silent note to a music too slow for waking life to notice. And now, as you drift a little farther over this terrace of patient bodies and slow houses, the trench seems to breathe around you in long, dark intervals, and your own thoughts may begin to resemble the marine snow itself, descending without effort, touching down softly, no longer needing to rise again, while the glass sponges remain upright in their crystal quiet. The sea pens sway in the current, the brittle stars hold their careful positions, and the whole sleeping ocean keeps its ancient rhythm without interruption, offering you one more peaceful lesson from the deepest creatures of Earth, that there is no need to hurry toward rest, because rest is already here, in the soft current, in the cool dark, in the untroubled lives of beings who have mastered the art of receiving, conserving, and letting the world move gently through them, until this bedtime story becomes a cradle of water and silence, and you too can simply float, soften, and fall asleep inside the gentle choir of the filter feeders, continuing in the same calm serialized rhythm established by your sample. This sleep story now drifts farther along the Hadal terrace, where the current is slow, the darkness is velvety, and the whole deep ocean seems to breathe in long, unhurried intervals. Here, in this bedtime story, the seafloor gently falls away again into a broader and quieter reach of water. And as you hover above it, the world below feels softer than stone and older than memory. a moonless landscape of fine sediment, pale outcrops, and silent living forms that have spent ages learning how to survive by using very little, by resisting nothing unnecessary, by trusting the steady rhythm of the deep. And in this nighttime story, that patient way of living becomes a relaxing story all its own, a lesson in how to soften the mind, how to release the day, and how to fall asleep as slowly and naturally as marine snow settling through dark water above the seafloor. Delicate gelatinous animals begin to appear more often now, not in crowds, but one by one, each one drifting through the blackness like a suspended thought, and among them are bell-shaped jellies so transparent and so lightly pulsing that they seem almost made from the water itself, rising and falling with the gentlest contractions, their bodies carrying a faint glow, or catching the smallest hint of dimness in a way that makes them look like soft lamps dimmed for deep sleep. And as they pass, they ask nothing of the trench. They simply continue moving through the cold with an elegance so effortless that your own breathing may begin to imitate them. Slow pulse by slow pulse, a little farther out in the open water, a comb jelly glides by with rows of cilia that ripple in perfect order, turning motion into the faintest ribbon of rainbow shimmer. And then, just as quietly, the colors vanish again, leaving the darkness untouched and peaceful, while below it, a sea cucumber crosses the sediment in its humble and useful way, sorting nourishment from the upper layer of mud that has taken so long to arrive from the waters above. And near that calm little traveler, amphipods gather in tiny groups wherever a few richer particles have settled, each one living a brief and careful life within the much larger stillness of the abyss. This is one of the deep sea's most comforting truths, that the great hidden world below is sustained not by hurry, but by patience, not by excess, but by economy. And as this gentle bedtime narration continues, every creature seems to reveal some variation of the same peaceful principle, whether it is the jelly pulsing only when needed, the sea cucumber feeding only on what the sediment offers, or the brittle star lifting its delicate arms into the current and trusting the water to bring what can be gathered on a low ridge of darker stone ahead. Pale anemones open their soft tentacles like underwater flowers in eternal night, and between them, small shrimps or tiny crustaceans move with careful precision, sheltering among folds and branches where the current leaves behind edible traces, while farther along the ridge, a sparse thicket of cold water coral holds its slow and ancient shape, providing a little structure in the soft openness, a little neighborhood in the broad dark, a little reminder that even here, the deep sea keeps building homes in silence. Drifting above those pale branches is a transparent larvation house, delicate and ghost-like, almost invisible except where its outline catches the imagination. And inside such temporary structures, the animal that made it would have filtered tiny particles from the water before eventually leaving the house behind to sink. And there is something profoundly soothing in that image, a clear little home descending through black water to become part of the nourishment below. As if in the deep ocean, even abandonment is gentle. Even endings continue to feed the world. Now Now the Hadal water around you feels more spacious than ever, and yet nothing about it feels lonely, because the deep is full of soft presences, of drifting bells, of living threads, of quietly feeding bodies anchored to stone or moving across mud with almost no disturbance at all. And as you float among them, this sleep story becomes less about travel and more about surrender, less about reaching a destination, and more about allowing the immense calm of the trench to settle through you layer by layer, until even your thoughts begin to behave like deep-sea creatures, moving less, glowing less, needing less, becoming simpler and slower in the most welcome way, somewhere in the distance, perhaps too far to see clearly. A siphonophore extends through the water like a faint strand of living light, each tiny part contributing to the whole without urgency. And nearer to you, another jelly pulses once, and then simply hangs there, suspended in the dark as though resting between breaths, while the marine snow continues its long downward drift, softening the ridge, feeding the scavengers, dusting the coral branches, and turning the entire Hadal world into a kind of underwater lullaby written in particles and patience. And so this relaxing story carries you onward through the endless water, where the bells of the deep keep their slow, silent rhythm, where the sea cucumbers continue their calm work below, where the brittle stars wait with fine open arms, and where every drifting transparent body seems to demonstrate the same ancient wisdom. That rest does not have to be forced. That stillness can be enough. And that deep sleep can arrive the way the deep ocean does everything best, gently, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until you are no longer trying to follow the story at all, only floating within it, held by the cool pressure, soothed by the endless dark, and rocked by the soft bells in the water as they pulse their way through the quiet and lead you farther into rest, continuing in the same calm serialized rhythm shaped by your sample. This sleep story now carries you farther into the open Hadal dark, where the water feels endless, gentle, and almost tender in its stillness. In this bedtime story, there is no hurry now, no need to descend much farther, only the quiet pleasure of drifting through a part of the deep ocean where everything seems softened by distance and pressure, and where the creatures around you live with such measured grace that they turn the vast black water into a kind of underwater lullaby. A relaxing story whispered not in words, but in pulses, glides, and long, patient silences. Here, the seafloor lies far below in dim, pale folds, while the water between you and the bottom is filled with delicate life. And one of the loveliest deep-sea presences to meet in this gentle bedtime hour is the siphonophore, that extraordinary drifting colony made not from one body alone, but from many specialized beings joined together so seamlessly that they seem to move as one, extending through the darkness like a silver thread, faintly luminous in places, almost like a necklace unfastened and left to float in a sleeping sea. As you hover near one in imagination, you may notice how little effort it seems to spend, how perfectly it trusts the current to carry its long, transparent form. And there is something deeply restful in that trust, because the siphonophore survives not through strain, but through cooperation, with each part of the colony doing only what it was shaped to do, while the whole drifting structure remains elegant, quiet, and complete. Nearby, tiny crustaceans flicker in and out of awareness, moving in brief and careful motions. And farther away, a comb, jelly, turns its ordered rows of cilia through the black water, catching the faintest hint of light and bending it into a ripple of rainbow shimmer that appears for a moment like a dream remembering itself before slipping away again. A little below you, a transparent jelly pulses once and then settles into near stillness, its bell so soft and clear that it seems made from the ocean's own breath. And not far beneath that drifting body, a pale snailfish glides low over the sediment, flexible and gentle, built for the crushing pressure by being supple rather than stiff. And once again, the deep sea offers one of its most peaceful lessons, that survival in the heaviest places often comes through softness, through calm design, through yielding so completely to the world around you that the world can no longer feel like an enemy at all. The marine snow continues to fall through everything, that slow and constant weather of the ocean. And now, in this sleep story, it seems almost like a second current moving downward through the first, each tiny particle crossing the water with quiet purpose until it settles on the trench floor below, feeding sea cucumbers, amphipods, worms, and all the other patient keepers of the seabed. And perhaps that is one of the most comforting truths you can rest beside tonight, that even the smallest drifting thing can matter in the deep. That nourishment can arrive almost invisibly, and that life here goes on by receiving gently rather than grasping quickly. Head, a faint chain of salps, soft, barrel-shaped drifters linked together in a transparent procession, moves through the water as though following some secret bedtime path, filtering tiny food particles as they go. And their fragile bodies seem so calm and so orderly that they feel like beads sliding slowly through dark fingers, each one helping the next, each one part of a larger softness. Beyond them, near a low ridge, a few pale anemones open their tentacles into the passing current, while brittle stars hold their careful positions on the stone, and the whole hidden landscape remains so low in energy, so devoted to measured living, that your own thoughts may by now be thinning out like distant lights, fewer and farther apart, less eager to rise, more willing to drift. This is what the deep sea does so beautifully in a nighttime story like this one. It replaces urgency with rhythm, brightness with glimmer, effort with suspension, and all around you, the creatures seem to agree on the same ancient method for remaining here. Conserve, drift, gather, pulse, glow only when needed, and let the dark do the rest. Even a larvation house drifting downward through the open water feels like part of that same wisdom. A transparent little home released at the right moment, sinking quietly toward the plain below, where it will become food for something else, as if the ocean had perfected the art of letting go without waste. Now the current is so soft that it feels less like movement and more like being held, and the silver thread of the siphonophore continues its long, graceful passage through the water. While the comb jelly's faint rainbow disappears, the jelly bell settles into the dark. The salp chain passes onward, and the snailfish keeps its calm route above the sediment. Each creature adding one more soft note to the great underwater cradle around you, until this bedtime story becomes almost too gentle to follow with the waking mind. And that is perfectly welcome, because you do not need to hold every fact now. Only the feeling they leave behind, the feeling of an ocean where deep-sea creatures survive through patience and elegance, where the current carries what it must, where the dark remains kind, and where your own body can finally do the same as the drifting life around you. Soften, loosen, float, and fall asleep beneath the sleeping current, continuing in the same calm serialized rhythm shaped by your sample. This sleep story now carries you through an even softer corridor of Hadal water, where the open dark feels almost velvety enough to touch, and every drifting creature seems to move in time with your breathing. In this bedtime story, there is no real sense of above or below anymore, only a slow suspension inside the ocean's deepest hush. And as you float there, the water around you begins to fill with a loose and gentle procession of tiny living forms, not crowded, never hurried, but gathered in a patient way, as though the sea itself had scattered a handful of soft silver seeds into the darkness, and then allowed them to drift wherever the current wished. These are the small and often overlooked creatures of the deep, the shrimp-like scavengers, the drifting salps, the larval forms, the fine-bodied planktonic wanderers that rarely become the stars of waking conversation, and yet in the hidden logic of the ocean they matter enormously, because so much of life below depends on the small, the suspended, the almost invisible, the little beings that feed, filter, drift, and are in turn woven into the larger fabric of the deep. Ahead of you, a calm procession of amphipods rises briefly into the water and then settles again. Tiny curved bodies moving in delicate starts and pauses. And though they are minute, there is nothing insignificant about them here, because in the Hadal world, even the smallest scavenger can play a quiet and necessary role, helping to break down what sinks from above and returning it slowly into the living cycle of the trench, while nearby a chain of salps passes like transparent beads, each one filtering the water for tiny food particles and moving with such order and softness that the whole drifting line seems more like a sleeping thought than a colony of animals a little farther along. One of the deep sea's transparent larval creatures hovers in the dark, almost glass clear, with tiny structures extended into the current, and it reminds you that so many ocean animals begin life in forms astonishingly delicate, as though the sea prefers to introduce its creatures first as drifting whispers before shaping them into whatever they will later become. And there is something deeply soothing in that image, the idea that life in the ocean often begins by floating, by trusting, by being carried rather than forcing its way forward. Around you, the marine snow continues to fall in fine, slow threads, and now it mingles with the sleeping swarm itself, so that particles of food and particles of life seem to share the same quiet path through the water, each tiny speck descending or hovering with equal gentleness, while farther below, beyond the reach of your hands, but not your imagination, sea cucumbers and small trench scavengers continue their patient work over the sediment, receiving what arrives without hurry, processing what they can, and leaving the Hadal floor as calm as they found it. Here too drift arrow worms, delicate, transparent hunters of the planktonic world, moving with such quiet precision that they seem like thin slivers of intention passing through the black. And not far away, a little cluster of copepods, among the ocean's most abundant small animals, flickers through the water like dust motes in a moonless room, proving once again that abundance in the deep is often subtle rather than obvious, hidden in countless tiny motions that together sustain a world too large and too dark to reveal itself all at once. In this relaxing story, none of these creatures needs to feel sharp or startling, because even the small hunters and scavengers are part of the same low-energy rhythm, living by brief efforts and long pauses, by measured feeding and careful drifting. And as you continue to hover among them, it becomes easier to sense that the deep sea is held together less by dramatic events than by endless quiet transactions. One particle eaten, one current followed, one transparent body filtering another mouthful from the dark. Somewhere off to one side, a comb jelly passes, and its cilia catch a trace of light in a rainbow shimmer, so faint it seems to belong to memory more than sight, while farther away, a siphonophore trails through the water in a dim silver thread. And all around those larger drifters, the tiny swarm continues, salps pulsing softly, copepods flickering, amphipods rising and falling, larval creatures hanging nearly motionless in the current, each one adding a small note to the ocean's long lullaby. Perhaps that is one of the most restful facts of all, that the deep is not only home to strange and beautiful larger animals, but also to vast communities of the small and soft, the nearly invisible beings whose drifting lives support so much else below. And once you begin to notice them, the ocean no longer feels empty in any direction, only finely inhabited, delicately alive, full of quiet motion, too subtle to disturb your growing sleepiness. Now your thoughts may be thinning out in the same way. These little creatures drift apart and gather again, no longer clustering around the day above, no longer trying to rise back toward the surface world, but simply moving with the current that carries them. While the salp chain continues its gentle procession, the copepods flicker and fade into the dark. The arrow worms slip soundlessly through the water, and the marine snow keeps falling through everything with patient certainty, until this bedtime story becomes almost lighter than language, a calm underwater cradle where the smallest lives in the sea guide you deeper into rest, teaching you by their own example that it is enough now to float softly, to do very little, and to let the endless sleeping swarm carry you all the way toward deep sleep, continuing in the same calm serialized rhythm established by your sample. This sleep story now carries you into a part of the Hadal water where the darkness feels softer than velvet, and the smallest lights seem to bloom and fade like sleepy thoughts. In this bedtime story, the drifting swarm around you has begun to thin and spread, and now the open water feels wider again, more spacious, more dreamlike, as though the ocean has quietly opened another room for your resting mind. And in this nighttime story, you do not need to follow any path at all, because the deep itself is guiding you, holding you in a cool and steady hush, while the trench floor lies far below in dim pale folds. And the water around you remains full of lives that have learned to glow only when it matters, to save their energy to shine in whispers rather than declarations. Here, in the hidden middle distance of the deep, one of the loveliest truths is that bioluminescence is not rare at all, but common, a gentle language of living light spoken by jellyfish, fish, squid, crustaceans, and colonies of drifting animals. And yet, even though it is widespread, it is almost never wasteful, because most creatures of the deep use light with remarkable restraint, flashing briefly to communicate, to blend into the dimness above, to confuse a predator, or to attract a meal, and then returning at once to the kind dark that suits them best. Ahead of you, a small lanternfish glides through the water, its underside dotted with tiny photophores arranged like a patient necklace. And though its body is modest and its passing nearly silent, it belongs to one of the most abundant groups of deep-sea fish on Earth, which means that the great dark ocean is supported not only by strange and dramatic forms, but by quiet, shining multitudes, small, soft swimmers whose lights are measured and useful, as if the sea had taught them exactly how much brightness a bedtime world can bear. A little farther on, a hatchetfish turns just enough for the faint suggestion of its silver body to catch your imagination, then disappears again, leaving only the memory of shape and the gentle knowledge that its downward-facing lights help it hide by matching the dimness filtering from waters far above. And there is something deeply peaceful in that strategy, because even here in the pressure-heavy dark, survival can come through harmony, through matching, through becoming part of the night rather than pushing against it. Nearer to you now, an Attala jelly drifts in the water like a little transparent bell, all delicate edges and slow pulse. And though it is known for producing rings of blue light when disturbed, in this relaxing story, it moves undisturbed and graceful, its body simply rising and settling in the blackness with the calm composure of a living lantern, not yet lit, while beside it, a combed jelly passes with its fine ciliary rows, making a faint rainbow shimmer that feels less like illumination and more like the deep ocean remembering color in its sleep. Below them, almost too softly to notice at first, marine snow continues its endless descent. And every flake that passes through this field of potential light seems to make the water richer, fuller, more inhabited, while beneath that soft, whether the trench floor keeps receiving what falls, feeding sea cucumbers, amphipods, and the patient scavengers who live by the ocean's slow generosity. Not all the deep-sea lights come from fish or jellies, and that too is soothing to imagine, because some glows are made by bacteria living in partnership with larger bodies, some by tiny drifting crustaceans, some by siphonophores moving through the water as colonies of faint beads, and all of them together create not a bright underwater city, but something far gentler, a scattered constellation of brief and courteous signals, each one appearing just long enough to be known before giving the dark back to itself. The farther this gentle bedtime journey carries you, the more these living lanterns begin to feel like part of your own slowing mind, thoughts appearing faintly, glowing for a moment, then dimming before they can gather force. And perhaps that is why the deep sea can make such a natural sleep story, because it teaches a rhythm of brief attention followed by release, of soft notice followed by softness again, of little glimmers that do not demand to be held somewhere beyond your nearest view. A siphonophore extends through the water like a silver thread with dim blue accents, and near it, a tiny shrimp gives off a brief flash before disappearing into the larger black, while the lanternfish continues its calm route through the open water, unhurried and exact. And all around them, the Hadal Ocean remains serene, cold, and deeply composed. A place where light exists, but never overwhelms, where motion happens, but never rushes, where every body seems shaped by the same old wisdom: conserve, adapt, glow gently, return to stillness. And now, as this calming narration settles more deeply around you, the blue whisper of the living lanterns becomes softer and softer, the lights fewer, the dark kinder, the current steadier, until the whole ocean feels like a great sleeping ceiling of water over a deeper sleeping floor. And you, suspended between them, can simply drift with the lanternfish. Rest beside the unlit jelly, watch the silver thread recede into distance, and let your own thoughts flicker and fade in the same gentle way, growing quieter with each slow breath, becoming less solid, less urgent, less bright, until this bedtime story turns into pure stillness and carries you effortlessly and almost invisibly toward deep sleep. Now, in this final sleep story chapter, the deep ocean asks nothing more of you than rest. And this bedtime story becomes a nighttime story made almost entirely of softness, a relaxing story that no longer needs to travel farther or explain more. Because by now you have drifted among lanternfish and hatchetfish, watched comb jellies turn motion into faint rainbows past the quiet grace of the dumbo octopus, the velvet calm of the vampire squid, the patient wandering of sea cucumbers, the crystal stillness of glass sponges, the pale gardens of sea pens and anemones, the drifting houses of larvaceans, the silver threads of siphonophores, the tiny sleeping swarm of salps and copepods, the soft labor of amphipods on the trench floor, and even the long vigil of the deep sea, mothers guarding their eggs in the dark. And all of those gentle facts have slowly gathered around you like layers of cool water, until the whole deep sea has become not a distant place, but a cradle, not a mystery to solve, but a quiet world in which everything lives by patience, by softness, by using only what is needed, by glowing only when it matters, and by trusting the dark to hold what the light does not reach. Here, at the end of this calming narration, there is no need for any more descent, because you are already resting in the oldest hush of the ocean, suspended in water, so calm it feels like velvet, while far below the Hadal floor lies smooth and pale beneath its continuing drift of marine snow. And far above the brighter world has become only an idea, something softened by distance, something so remote that it can no longer ask anything of you tonight. And this is perhaps the most soothing truth the deep-sea creatures have offered all along, that life does not need noise in order to be full, and it does not need speed in order to continue. Because in the hidden waters below the sun, everything enduring has learned how to slow down. The lanternfish keep their modest lights. The jellies pulse once and then rest in the water, as if pausing between dreams. The brittle stars remain open to the current. The sea pigs and holothurians continue their slow, moonless crossing of the mud. The corals grow in darkness branch by branch. The sponges filter what comes. The tiny drifting creatures feed and are fed in turn, and the marine snow goes on falling through all of it with a steady tenderness that asks for nothing except time. And as you listen to this gentle bedtime ending, your own thoughts may begin to resemble that snowfall now, descending in smaller and smaller pieces, landing more softly, scattering no farther, simply settling into silence. If a final image helps you fall asleep, let it be this one: that somewhere in the open dark, a transparent jelly is floating with its bell barely moving. And not far away, a comb jelly glimmers once and lets the color go, while beneath them, a small snailfish glides low over the seafloor. And beside a quiet stone, a pale octopus keeps her patient watch. And over everything, the great water remains cool, heavy, protective, a blanket without edge, a world without hurry. And inside that world, every creature is doing exactly enough, no more, no less, which is why this sleep story can fade so gently now, because the deep has already taught the lesson it came to teach. That rest is not something you force, but something you enter slowly, the way a drifting body enters darker water, the way a jelly enters stillness after a pulse, the way a particle of marine snow lets itself fall. So let this bedtime story grow softer now, softer than words, softer than memory. As the living lanterns dim and the transparent drifters become harder to distinguish from the water around them, as the coral gardens recede into velvety black, as the trench floor smooths itself into a quiet plain beneath you, as every deep-sea fact you heard tonight loosens its outline and becomes only feeling, only calm, only the lingering sense of a planet full of hidden tenderness. And if any thought still remains bright, let it drift farther away now. Let it become a distant blue whisper, like bioluminescence fading in the midnight sea. Let it soften until it no longer needs your attention, because this relaxing story is finished traveling. This nighttime story is finished gathering wonders, and all that remains is the slow and peaceful art of letting go. The current is barely there now, just enough to rock the water, just enough to cradle the drifting creatures in their endless patient world. And you may imagine yourself resting among them without weight, without effort, while the sea continues in its ancient way around you, filtering, glowing, drifting, settling, guarding, enduring. And little by little, even the story itself begins to sleep, its sentences lengthening and thinning like transparent fins in the dark, its facts dissolving into hush, its voice receding into the same vast stillness that holds the trench and all its quiet lives, until there is almost nothing left but softness, almost nothing left but cool dark water, almost nothing left but the feeling of being held. And if you are ready now, you can simply follow the deep-sea creatures into their oldest wisdom, into their serene, untroubled rhythm, into the great calm below all hurry, and let yourself fall asleep. Then sink into deep sleep while the last soft light beneath the sea folds gently inward and disappears.